Hello everyone and welcome to this chess openings video, which I'm doing today because a viewer had a great comment where they requested a video showing the pros and cons of an opening. So instead of diving into one specific opening, I'm going to try and just do broad coverage of many openings, showing you the pros and cons. Chess is difficult. There are many things to decide in a game, and even before the game, especially when it comes to openings. What strategy will you use in the opening? What opening should you even begin with? Big questions. So I would say it depends on a lot of factors. Are you a beginner? Do you have more experience? Do you like to play tactical games or strategic games? Do you like to attack? Do you like to maneuver, play defense? All these questions, you have to kind of decide. And it might be tough to do that. You can just play a bunch of different openings and see what you like best, or watch games of the best players. And, if an opening looks interesting, try it. But we'll start today with saying that first, especially if you're a beginner, you should just pick an opening by white and then an opening by black and kind of stick with it for a little while. That could be weeks or months. It'd probably take a few months, maybe even 6 months of staying with an opening to really see how it works. All right, so diving in here, the first thing you have to do is decide what would you play with white. So if we look at this database, the most commonly played first move is e4. And, you could ask yourself, well, what does this e4 move do here? Bobby Fischer once said that e4 is best by test, that he felt that was the best opening move because it does help control the center, gain space in the center, and it's always important to control the center of the board if you can. And whether by placing pieces in there that attack center squares, or attacking the squares in the center from a distance. So e4 is a good move if you like tactical games, because usually the game opens up. So I would say the pros are, that it's a solid opening move. It helps control the center. It does a lot of things. It lets you develop your bishop quickly. Your queen could come out. By doing that, it helps you get castled quicker by playing the e-pawn, because then you just have to move the bishop out, the knight, and you're ready to castle to safety. So that is a pro, that it helps you castle quickly, helps you develop pieces quickly. Are there cons? Well, I guess if you don't like really tactical games, maybe you want to play d4 instead, moving the queen pawn out 2 squares, because that would lead to more strategic games. But if we look at e4 a little bit closer, usually because e4 is played, a lot of times d4 will be played and the pawns will be exchanged off. White will not usually play d4 immediately, but just in general, e4 moves, openings, tend to exchange off in the center more often, leaving the position more open and giving your pieces more room to move around the board, giving players opportunities for more tactics, which is good if you're a beginner, because you definitely should try and learn tactics, improve your tactics, and just get comfortable with tactics overall. So if we look at d4, these games usually tend to be more strategic, because d5 will be played Let's see if that's the most often played move. So after d4, it looks like knight to f6 is played most often next. But a lot of times the game will continue with c4 being played. And then, here it shows e6, but a lot of times d5 will be played eventually. So we could play the most played moves, which is this, and then the second most played move already is d5 here. So at this point, the center's kind of locked up. Maybe this capture could occur here, but these pawns are kind of blocked. The e pawn, will probably go to e3, and then both sides will have to maneuver around the center. So the pros and cons for d4. Well, if you like tactics, this could be a con playing this opening because there's probably not as many tactics. Of course, e4 or d4 can both be strategic or tactical. It depends on what happens later in the game. But in general, in the opening, d4 will lead to more strategic games. And, if you like tactics, you may not want to play this. And so d4 games can be a little more complicated, especially for beginners who, maybe haven't learned all the ins and outs of strategy and maneuvering yet. And they might, not know what to play, not know or be able to find the best moves. All right. So if we move on, if we just go back for now to the beginning, we looked at e4. The pros, the games are probably a little easier to play, maybe because they're straightforward. You just attack in the center, trade, get your pieces out as fast as you can, get your king castle to safety quickly. The cons, if you don't like if you don't like tactical games and you prefer slower strategic games, well, then you might not want to play e4. d4 is the opposite. If you like strategy, maybe play d4. If you like tactics, then e4. So what are the other options for white in the beginning? Well, the third most played move, it looks like, is knight to f3. And so what are the pros and cons of this move? Well, it develops a piece out towards the center. For a knight, f3 is almost always a good move. It also kind of waits to see what your opponent will do. So it's kind of a flexible move, allowing your opponent options. So that could be a con as well, because now you don't know what your opponent will do. You give him more options. He could play, e6. If he probably wouldn't play e5, or you could capture him. But e6, he could play d6. He could play d5, c6, c5. He could fianchetto his bishop. So that could be the con. By playing knight to f3, you give your opponent a lot of options, and then you would have to know how to play all those. But the pro is that this is a flexible move, giving you options as well. So, maybe this is a little more complicated. Beginners may not want to play it, but you could try it just for fun, experiment. All right, so what else? It looks like c4 is the next most played move. The pros, this move attacks a valuable central square here. It also moves this pawn out. That way you can bring your knight in behind it instead of moving to c3 and blocking this pawn. Because a lot of times this c pawn can be a valuable attacker of the center here, this d5 square, kind of preventing the d5 pawn from moving out here immediately. Because if the pawn did move here, you could just capture it, trading a less valuable pawn on the side for the more valuable central pawn. And if the queen recaptured, you could attack the queen immediately, making black waste time and running away. So c4, the pros, well, it attacks the center from the side. It pushes this pawn out, allowing you to get the knight in behind it and not move the knight to c3, blocking that pawn. The cons, it may be a little more complicated, the variations that come about from this opening, which is the English opening. So, I wouldn't recommend this for a beginner, but, you could always try it and just see what happens. That way you get a little experience in it. And if you're trying to figure out what opening to do and you think you see something you like, I would also recommend going over some games by the top players. Just play through a bunch of their games and see how they play that opening, just so you can kind of learn the basic ideas for that opening. All right. And then after you look at some of their games, then play a bunch of games with that opening yourself just to test out what you are learning. And it looks like g3 is the next option. So once again, this is kind of a move like c4, maybe not a move I would recommend to a beginner because it's a little more complicated. You fianchetto here, but then your opponent has all different options that they can play against this. And so then you would have to be prepared and try to learn what to do against all those options. So the con is that it can be complicated. The pro is that, well, it helps you fianchetto this bishop to a good square where it attacks down the entire center of the board here all the way over to the queen side. Maybe putting pressure on this b pawn and potentially eyeing this rook here. But this could be more of a complicated option. Well, the video will go on quite long if I look at everything, so I'll kind of stop there. For just the first move for white, we could flip it around and see what black would do, but I will just focus on, I'll keep the board with white's perspective, and we'll just start again with e4. So if you're a beginner, I would definitely recommend e4 and get used to this opening because you can learn a lot. This also restricts your opponent's options on what they can do. They still have a lot of options. So as black, if you know that your opponent plays e4, well, then you have to decide what to do, what to play against that. And there are a lot of options. If you're a beginner, probably e5 is a good solid response because it keeps the game kind of even and symmetrical. Things don't get too complicated. And then what is white's response here? Well, now white is probably most of the time going to play knight to f3. So, as black, you just have to decide what you want to play against this. And so the most common response by far is knight to c6. Why? Because this is a good solid move. It develops a piece, covers this pawn, and from here you just wait to see what white will do next. All right, so now here we decide with white what opening to play in this position. So you have bishop to c4, bishop to b5. So I'll start with the most often played move, and that's bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. So the pros and cons of playing this. Well, the pros are that this is a great opening that has been around for hundreds of years. So that could contribute also to a con because it's been around so long. There is so much opening theory that you would probably have to memorize a lot to play some of these lines. So another con is that this opening could become pretty complicated. But once white plays this opening, there are different variations that you can play. The pros, it's just a good, solid opening, one of the best openings for white out there. So, at some point, I would highly recommend playing and learning it. But, maybe if you're a beginner, you want to hold off on this and instead play the second most common move, bishop to c4. That's a great option, the Italian game, which I covered in a previous video. I did an introduction. In the future, I will try to go more in depth into this opening. So the pros and cons of this opening. Well, the pros are it helps control the center. It attacks this weak square next to your opponent's king. It develops pieces quickly and allows you to castle quickly. It's also a good opening for beginners to learn from because they can learn about tactics, trying to develop an attack here on the king side, targeting this weak square that's only protected by the king. It teaches you how to develop your pieces quickly, get your king to safety. So a lot of pros. This is a good solid opening for beginners to learn. It's not too complicated, although any opening can have complicated variations and more simple variations. So that's another thing that you will have to decide in your chess games, whether you like crazy tactics or slower, more strategical variations. All right. Well, I can't dig too deeply, excuse me, in each opening since I'm trying to cover a lot. So I'll just leave it at that. The cons for this opening, well, I don't see too many, although one could be that many people are familiar with this opening. So they might know what to play against it, most of your opponents. So you may have to find a line that's not quite the best to play as white. Pick the second best move, a few variations in, or a few moves in, and kind of throw them off, because a lot of the best moves may be memorized or known by your opponent. So that, is one possibility. But if you're playing beginners, you could probably surprise them a lot because they may not be as familiar with this opening. All right, well, let's go back and look at another option here. White could play d4, the Scotch game. Also, a pretty good opening for beginners to play. This could be another option for you to learn. The pros of this opening, well, it immediately develops both of your pawns in the center, which is always a good idea. And by doing this, it gives your gives your pieces much room, a lot of room to develop here. The bishops are both free to develop now. The knight is probably going to develop here to c3. You'll be ready to castle. This is also a good solid opening. So what will your opponent play here? He'll probably capture this pawn. That looks like that's the most common move by far. So he captures, and then the most common move is just a recapture. So already you've exchanged off pawns in the middle, kind of opening the position. So the pros and cons. Pros, you have a nice open position, plenty of room for your pieces to move. If you like tactics, there'll probably be room for your pieces to develop and have tactical opportunities. The cons, maybe you don't want to play this if you don't like tactics as much and you like more strategic games. But I would at least give it a try and try different variations and see what you think. Um, well, that's about all I will go into that opening. That way I can cover a lot more. So, if we go back to this position, one final option I'll look at is knight to c3 here, the 3 knights opening. A lot of times this will just develop into the 4 knights game, which is the most commonly played move. So the pros and cons of this kind of opening, well, the cons, may be, or this could be a pro depending on your point of view, is that the game is highly symmetrical. So, the game could be considered kind of boring, although even boring games can turn and become exciting in a hurry. There's always that possibility. So, the game, because of this symmetrical nature, people might not want to play it if they don't like these kind of openings. But, the pros, this game develops your knights out quickly, which is usually a good idea. It gives you time to see where your bishops will be best placed. It allows you, let's see what the next couple moves usually are. Bishop to b5 is the most played move by white, so it develops this bishop quickly, attacks, you're ready to castle. So a lot of pros here. It just helps you develop quickly. The games are probably not so complicated. So this could be another good option to try, especially as a beginner. Just try it out and see what you think. All right, just so I can cover more, I think I will stop there on the white variations with e4, e5, and this, what we've looked at. So going back further, let's see. Instead of e5, I'll take a quick look at the other options that your opponent has. And I better hurry or this video will just go on and be quite long. So, as white and black, you will have to decide what to play here as black, because this is the most common move played by white will be e4. And so you have to decide what you think will be best to play against it. So as a beginner, as I said, e5 is probably the best move to start with, because the games are they're more straightforward. You'll be able to develop easy, get your king to safety pretty quick. But if we go back and we look at the other options here, okay, you also have e6. And so as white, you would have to decide what to do against this move, which is the French defense. So the pros and cons of the French defense. Well, the pros, this is a good, solid opening that's been around for a long time. So once again, that could be part of the cons. Any opening that's been around for a long time will have a lot of theory and a lot of stuff that you will have to remember. But as with any opening, there are ways to play the opening where you can kind of avoid having to memorize a lot. So one example here, usually when a move is played by your opponent that lets you put both pawns in the center, that is almost always a great move to play. And if we look back here, d4 is by far the most played move in the French defense. Because if your opponent is going to let you put both these pawns out in the center and control all these central squares and give your pieces room to develop like this, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? So now the most common move is to just continue in the manner of the French defense with d5. So that's why e6 was played, to allow you to push d5, and now this d5 pawn is backed up by this other pawn, and you're attacking white. So it's kind of a counter-attacking opening, and now white will be forced to make a decision here. Now, what I mentioned a little while ago about a game being full of theory and ways to take shortcuts that maybe wouldn't be quite as good as the theory, the mainline theory, but still, a good option. Here, white has different moves they can play. Knight to c3, knight to d2, e5. But the fourth most played move is e takes d5. So immediately by doing this, you knock out a lot of the theory by simplifying the game. And so the pros and cons to doing that: the pro is you limited your opponent's options, you simplified the game, making it easier. The cons, maybe you took away some of the best plans and exchanged that for easier play, so maybe you won't have as many opportunities to play the best moves that you could have if you hadn't taken this route. But still, you're pretty fine here. The most common played move now is knight to f3, so you're developing quickly. Your opponent's most played move is to respond, and then we have bishop to d3, most often played. Now you're ready to castle. The opponent many times will just play in a symmetrical response here, and now the most played move is just to castle immediately here, and opponent follows suit. And so you get the picture. This allows you to develop quickly, get your pieces out, and it's pretty straightforward, not as complicated. And now you have open lines on your king, your opponent's king. But the cons could be that they also have open lines against your king. So once again, this could be good for beginners to learn all about tactics and attacking the king. Also defending against tactics and defending your king. And a very good piece of advice, not only in the openings, but in the whole chess game, from opening, middle game, end game, is a little technique where before you make a move, try to quickly make sure that your king is safe, your pieces are safe, and your pawns are safe. So if your opponent makes a move, or you are about to make a move, do a quick little check and just ask yourself, all right, can he check my king? Is it going to cause any surprises that get me in trouble? And then once you're sure your king is safe, just do a quick check on your pieces, make sure they're all protected and safe. And then finally the pawns, make sure they are safe so you don't just lose a pawn that you didn't have to. And so by doing that, that'll save you a lot of blunders and losses. And also, once you do that, then you can look at your opponent's king, pieces, and pawns and kind of look to see if you can attack their king and check with some advantage, or capture an unprotected piece or pawn. So that's a good solid way to play better chess, avoid blunders, and hopefully give you an advantage. All right, going back here, we'll go back, let's see here. We'll just go back to the beginning and e4. So we looked at the French defense, the pros and cons. A good solid opening, possibly a good way for black to counterattack white and force white to make a decision. The cons, well, one thing that could happen is, let's see, if the common moves were played in the beginning, white could have the option to play something like this. So now we have the center of the board locked up. So the French defense could lead to a lot of maneuvering and strategical gameplay that makes the players have to play around this locked center, maneuver around it with their pawns and pieces. So the French defense could be a little more complicated, and that's true with any opening in certain variations. So you'll just have to experiment with it and see what you think. So pros and cons. The French defense is a good, solid opening for black. The cons, it could lead to locked up strategical positions, and if you don't want that, maybe you would want to avoid it. But once again, try it out for a little bit and see what you think. Look at games played by the best players to see if they interest you. All right, the video is already going pretty long, so let's take a look at other options here. Okay, instead of the French defense, we have other options. Looks like C5. The most common response by black is the Sicilian defense. So, pros and cons for the Sicilian defense. Well, the pros, it keeps the game unbalanced. It immediately counterattacks from the side. It attacks this central position. The most common follow-up is knight to f3 to help control the center, and especially this d4 square, allowing white to push this pawn forward, and it'll be protected by the knight. And now the most common response is d6. So you might think, well, what does this move do? Well, it does protect this c5 pawn, but it covers this e5 square here, which will allow the knight here on g8 to move to f6 and not be harassed by a pawn push here with pawn to e5, because then the pawn could just be captured. So it slows down any advances of this e pawn, and the game usually continues with d4 that opens Sicilian, or instead of that, bishop to b5. But first I'll take a quick look at this open Sicilian. So here the best move is probably just to capture this pawn, and that's played by far. So capture, this immediately forces white to make a decision. To keep the game even, this move is most often played. Now we have an attack on this pawn. Now it can't push forward attacking the knight, or it'll just be captured. So the most common move here is knight to c3. And now there are many different options, but a6 could be played to prevent the pieces from moving up here. Development could just continue with bringing another knight out, and then white may continue with something like this, or move the other bishop to c4. But you get the picture. The pieces just all develop. White is a little, black is a little cramped, so that could be a con in this position. In the Sicilian defense, sometimes black can be a little cramped and white has more space. But if we go back before I dig too deep into this variation, another option, instead of moving the pawn, because another con with the Sicilian is that it can become very complicated with so many variations. So I would not recommend this opening for beginners, or at least not the open Sicilian with d4, because there are just so many variations that you have to learn by both sides. So it can be pretty complicated. So, instead of playing d4, another option could be bishop to b5, the second most played move. And this limits the options by far here. So, what can black do? Block with knight to c6, knight to d7, or the most common move is bishop to d7, forcing white to make a decision here. And now white usually trades off the less valuable bad bishop that is blocked by its own colored, its pawn on its own colors here, for black's good bishop, which is on the opposite color as his central pawns. So that's probably a better trade for white in this opening. And then, black only has 3 good options. Well, excuse me, 2, because you don't want to capture with the king, and then you can't castle anymore. So, the most played move is queen captures, but the knight could capture as well. So, maybe the pros to this variation is that it's less complicated than other Sicilian lines, especially the open Sicilian. It doesn't give black as many options, and you can go deeper into the opening with maybe not as many problems. And so it just might be a little easier for you to play as white here. All right, I'll go back to the beginning here. So, the Sicilian defense, overall pros and cons. Pros, it's a solid attacking or counter-attacking opening for black. If you like tactics, there can be a lot of tactics in this opening, depending on what white plays, especially if it's an open Sicilian where he pushes this pawn early. White could try and find some more strategical options, which, remember, no matter what you play, if the opening is usually tactical or usually strategic, there's always those variations that go the other way from what it normally is. So you just have to experiment. The cons to the Sicilian, it's complicated. It can be complicated, so maybe beginners don't want to play it as often. The pros, if you like tactics and counter-attacking openings, you might like the Sicilian. All right, moving on. What other options here? Let's see. The 4th most played response, c6, the Caro-Kann defense. So another good, solid opening. Kind of like the French defense where you move to e6 and then pushed to d5. Here you can move the c6 pawn and push to d5, which allows a less valuable side pawn to back up the center. That way, and here white's, once again, most common response and probably the best response, or one of them, is to just take the center here. And then after this most common response in the Caro-Kann defense, now if you capture to simplify the position, now you have a recapture with this less valuable side pawn. So black keeps both of his central pawns. That is a pro. You outnumber white, who only has this one pawn in the center. So, other pros and cons for the Caro-Kann defense. And you don't have to simplify like that. White has other options here. They could instead play e5, the most common move, gathering space in the center, which is a good move. Anytime you can get more space than your opponent, that is usually good to do that. It's a pro, but be careful if you have more space and you trade off too many pieces, then that can leave a lot of openings in all that extra space that you have, and it'll be harder to guard that extra space if you trade too much material. And on the opposite end, if you have less space, it's better to trade off pieces to give your cramped position more room for your pieces that are remaining to maneuver. All right, so this is one option. The pro, it gives you more space, more room to maneuver. You kind of cramp your opponent's position. The cons, well, it kind of avoids conflict in the middle, so it takes away some of your options. It might make it a little easier for your opponent to, know what to play against it, as if you left this position and just played the second most played move, well, now there are different options here. Black could capture, and then you could recapture, or he could ignore this and just play g6. But this is the most common move. And then after a recapture, now there are many options by black. He can play bishop to f5, immediately attacking the knight, or he could develop a knight either to d7 or f6. So many different options. And I don't want to go into all those options, as this video has already gone pretty long here. So back to the beginning. The Caro-Kann, pros and cons. Pros, it's a good, solid opening, that's been tested. It's hard for white to break through and get a good advantage in this opening. It's very solid for black to play the Caro-Kann. The cons, maybe it is too solid and slow and defensive. If you like fast attacking games, then you may want to try something else, as these games are usually slower, more positional, and long games that go deep into the end game. All right, let's take a look here if there's anything else. After e4, we covered e5, e6, c5, c6, and there are other options. I won't go into all those. I'll do a quick look at this option. So this is the Scandinavian defense. The Scandinavian defense can lead to some positions similar to the Caro-Kann, but the pros and cons for black, it immediately allows white to capture, the most often played move, and then to keep the game even, many times black will immediately capture, although he can just ignore this pawn and develop his knight, the second most played move. But if this is played, well, now white can just play knight to c3, attacking the queen. The queen most often retreats to the side to line up on the king. So the cons, black has to take a little bit of time to retreat the queen, and the queen is out here early where it could become a target. So the pros to this opening, well, if we go back to the beginning, it immediately forces white to make a decision on what to do here. So it probably limits the possible variations that white can play right off the bat in the opening. So, you could try this out and just see what you think of this opening. And what other response here? Well, there are others. There's knight f6, the Alekhine's defense. So here, the pros, you immediately attack white, forcing him to make a decision. But the cons are that he can attack your knight and force you to run, giving him time to even attack again, possibly. And, if you retreat again, well, now he can grab the entire center of the board here. And, he gains a lot of space, and you kind of wasted some time running. But this opening, the idea behind it is that black will pull all these pawns by white into the center and then counterattack these pawns, trying to weaken them, thinking that white pushing these pawns believes that he is gaining a big, strong center, but black will try and counterattack against that center and weaken it and turn it into a weakness later in the game with broken pawns that are far up the board here. All right, so the Alekhine defense. If we go back, there are some other options, but that's all I'll cover today for the E4 opening, and I'll do a quick overview of the other option, D4. So many different possibilities in this opening. The pros and cons. The pros are it helps control the center. It's a good solid opening playing D4. It allows the bishop to develop. The cons could be that it's a strategic game that usually comes out of these D4 openings. They could be more complicated, especially for beginners. That's why E4 is usually recommended. And so what are the responses that could be played here? Looks like knight to F6 is played most often. And another thing about D4, there could be many complicated openings that arise from this. So C4 is played most often. And now you have all these options. E6 could be played. G6, which I'll take a quick look at. Black could set up a King's Indian defense. So usually knight to C3 is played. Then this. And now we have E4. White takes control of the center. And so D6 is played to prevent the pawn pushing here and attacking. Although it could still do that, but then black could capture, and after a recapture, black could exchange queens, and white's center has been broken open and maybe weakened a little bit. So the King's Indian defense here, pros and cons. Well, the pros for white could be that he gains more space in the center, has more room for his pieces. The cons for black, he could have a cramped position. The pros, it's a very good, solid defense for black. It gets his king castled to safety quickly. There are a lot of options for black to play here. And it's a good solid counter-attacking defense for black. So if we look at the most often played moves real quick, knight to F3, then black continues with castling, more development by white to E2, and now it looks like E5 is the most commonly played response. And then after castling, now we have knight to C6, D5, white gains more space, chasing the knight away, and then now it goes deeper into the strategy and development of the pieces and figuring out plans, which I won't go to. I won't go any deeper into this video. So the pros and cons. Well, we already saw that white has more space for his pieces to develop. The cons, black is a little bit cramped, but black's king is quickly in a safe position. And, this is a good solid defense, but I don't know if I'd recommend this for beginners because it can be complicated. We see that the center is locked up here. So if you don't like strategic maneuvering games, this could be a con because the center's locked and now you have to play on the wings. So here the most common move is knight to E1. That may look strange, but what that does is allow room for this f pawn to either push to f3 and guard this pawn, or even push forward here. So, if we look at the most commonly played moves, this knight moves, then we have knight to d3, repositioning the knight, and now play on the wings, f5 followed by f3. So you see where it's going. The center's locked and play occurs on the edges, on the sides, the wings, and it can be complicated. So that could be a con, that this could be a complicated game. All right, without digging further, let's go back. I'll go to the very beginning. So we were looking at d4. Pros, good solid opening choice. Cons, it leads to strategic games if you don't like strategic games. If you like those, try it out. But they are more difficult, and you need to have more knowledge of strategy when you're playing these d4 games. So we looked at a possible knight to f6 variation. The second most commonly played move is d5. So with beginners, you'll see this more often. So they keep the game symmetrical, fight for the center, and now possibly, the most often played move is c4, the Queen's Gambit, which you are all probably familiar with because of the very good series that was on Netflix, I believe. Very interesting chess series there that you should check out if you haven't already, the Queen's Gambit. All right, so here, why is this played? It's a gambit because you're offering to give up a pawn for some advantage in return. Now, if the gambit were accepted and black just captures, you could push your other pawn to e4 and take more control of the center here. But most often, it looks like e6 or c6 are played. So c6 is the Slav defense. Now, pros and cons. Pros, good solid opening. This c6 move helps fortify d5. It is a good solid move. Cons, you may want to push this pawn up to c5 anyway. So now you're taking two moves to do it instead of just jumping to c5 immediately later on. And also a con could be the Slav defense, I believe, is more complicated and leads to more complicated and maybe sharper lines. It might be harder to play. But I'm not completely familiar with the Slav defense, so I don't know all the ins and outs of it. The second most common move is e6. So here you just continue with the Queen's Gambit declined because you're not capturing this c pawn here. And then the most often played moves are knight to c3, and then knight to f6. So both sides just continue development. And now it looks like c capturing on d5 here is played most often. But another option is to just keep developing. So both sides develop. There's a pin on the knight, so that would be broken with the bishop move. And now this pawn can fortify the d pawn and not block the bishop in. Well, then it looks like castling followed by knight to f3. So just normal developing moves, and general opening principles are followed. Develop your pieces as fast as you can. Try not to move them more than once. Push your pawns in the center. Get your king castled to safety as quickly as possible. And then the game can continue with a knight move or attacking the bishop, but you get the idea. Pros and cons in the Queen's Gambit. Pros. Definitely a good, solid opening. If you like strategy and maneuvering and a longer, slower game, definitely try this out. A more safe game, your king is usually safer. There may be no surprise, quick, crazy attacks against your king. But that could be a con. If you like tactics, you like attacking, you may not prefer the Queen's Gambit declined here. So let's go back. So d4 is what we were covering. d5 is played most often, but other moves could be played. Usually if your opponent plays some random move like this, well, many times the best move is just to take control of the center. And if you don't know what to do and you're unfamiliar in any particular opening, try to fall back on general opening principles. Control the center. Develop your pieces as fast as you can and get your king castled to safety. And also, before you make moves, ask yourself what your opponent's last move did. What did this last move do? Well, it allowed the bishop to move, usually to b7, but maybe even to a6. But generally the bishop would just move here and maybe attack down the center and attack your pawn, which will be unprotected. So here, is your king safe? The things to ask yourself after your opponent makes a move. Yes, your king is safe. What about your pieces? Yes, they are. What about your pawns? No, this one is under attack. So then you would see that and be able to make a decision on what to play. Either knight to c3 to protect it, or bishop to d3, the most commonly played move, bringing the bishop out and protecting it. All right. Well, I'll try and wrap this video up, which probably is quite long by now. Pros and cons on e4. Good, solid opening for white for beginners. It allows pieces out quickly. It's a good tactical opening because usually the center pawns are exchanged off and you have a lot of room for your pieces, a lot of room to attack and maneuver. It'll help you learn tactics. The cons, if you don't like crazy tactical games, you may not want to play it, but just because e4 is usually more tactical doesn't mean it always is, and that goes for all openings in general. What they usually are, they can go the other way in certain variations. All right, so then d4, pros and cons. More strategic game, so cons if you like strategy and slower maneuvering games, you may like this, and that could be a con if you do not like that. And c4 is another option to play. And the pros, well, it brings this pawn out, allowing the knight to jump in behind it and not block that pawn in. It attacks the center, the more valuable center with the less valuable pawn. Maybe you can exchange off the C pawn for the D pawn. The cons, the English opening is usually a little more complicated, and black has quite a few different variations that you will have to become aware of and learn. So maybe not recommended for a beginner because it might be more complicated. But then again, if an opening looks interesting to you and you have fun, which is what chess is all about, trying to improve and have fun while you're doing it, and if that opening is something you like, go ahead and try it out. Look at games from the best players, and if they look interesting, play through some of those games, then try and play that game against your friends or the computer. All right, so I'll wrap this up. This video has been quite long. If you stuck around the whole time, I thank you. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions, requests for videos that you would like to see in the future, and I will try and get those out or work on those. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.